afternoon. I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Asian Aviation Magazine and AsianAviation.com. Today we're in conversation with David Dixon, president of Jetcraft Asia. It's one of the biggest jet brokers in Asia and, frankly, around the world. David, welcome to In Conversation. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. I'm welcome to be here and hope I can shed some light on what's going on in this rather unusual world.
Well, it is unusual right now, and I was taking a look at your website. Your company has been around for quite a while, and I noticed you've done 700 deals worth more than $12.5 billion in value over the past decade, even with the financial crisis. Give us the 50-cent tour of the company now, and give us kind of an idea, basically, of what's going on, because since global aviation is basically shut down, how are you working from home? I see you're in your office now, so Hong Kong is not quite as locked down as some areas of the world. Just give us the 50-cent tour of the business and how you're working through things right now.
Well, very much it's still the same in the sense that we're working. As you say, I'm in my office. I've been in here now for about the last 2 months since I returned from a trip, which I had to go into quarantine for. That was confined to apartments and things. But as far as the company is concerned, although it varies around the world, most people are able to work pretty normally, albeit virtually in some cases. We're making a lot of use of the obvious tools of the internet, video systems, etc., which might in fact become more useful going forward. One of the changes that may emerge from all of this is the greater use of the technologies to communicate. But by and large, it's much the same. We're doing deals. Not as many. This year's sort of started off well, like last year finished. But since this obvious pandemic has disrupted everything, it's put a spanner in the works, to put it mildly, in a lot of ways. But there's still activity, and we're still looking for every deal that's out there.
Well, I want to get to that later because that's interesting to me. And if you, like me, you've been watching a lot of webinars, I'll give a shout out to Alistair at Corporate Jet Investor. I like his because they come on at a decent time of the day. Even they're in Europe, I don't have to stay up all night to watch them. But it was interesting that brokers were fairly optimistic that when the lockdown ends, the industry could actually see an increase in customers, where you had some before that were sort of sitting on the fence about whether to buy, fractional membership or a card or something like that. But that the virus now might be actually a new selling tool or a motivation to get buyers into the market.
Quite possibly. After 2002-03, with SARS outbreak in Asia, where I was here then, it did generate some extra business. It did make people sort of move from being on the fence to being active owners of aeroplanes. So hopefully, from our business point of view, although obviously the reasons are rather unfortunate, that will generate some extra business, some new business, grow the business, on top of what was happening before. So that is certainly something we're looking to see out of the last quarter, maybe. Who knows when we're going to sort of return to a new normal. But I think the biggest factors are the unknowns. It's how will air travel generally from an airline perspective be managed. I think the airport process could become very complicated. I'm sure some of the people you've talked to have given ideas on how it's all going to be structured, but some of the stuff that's coming out is, from a passenger perspective, is going to be pretty tedious. So the airports might work in our favor, as maybe the airlines, in the restrictions, in the sort of control factor in the process. So if you've done a 15-hour flight from New York to Hong Kong, and suddenly you've got a few hours messing around on arrival, that might become a big turnoff. And then the other factor, I think we see it with the airlines pulling aircraft back, retiring airplanes. There's certain routes and frequencies will probably disappear. And there may well be city pairs that are crucial for people. And so the ownership of an aircraft will become a way to address that. So out of that sort of rather sad scenario, there may be some benefits for business aviation specifically.
It's interesting. We saw, and again, I got this from watching another webinar, but we saw sort of a bump of inactivity in business aviation at the beginning of this whole process in, say, March or so. People repositioning aircraft, owners putting the aircraft where they wanted it to, maybe near where they were going to be locked down or tied down, whether it was Florida or New York or whatever. Is there anything moving in Asia at the moment? As China commercial traffic has picked up a bit, but are there any flights? What about Australia? What about South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia? Is there any private traffic moving there now?
Well, it's a quilt. It's a patchwork. China's commercial aviation, as you say, is moving a little bit. There's nothing very much international, other than very sporadic flying. Korea, you can fly domestically. Japan, you can fly domestically. The other day, we just moved an airplane from Japan to the United States to go into maintenance for an inspection. So you can move around. Australia's, other than Queensland, that's the most restrictive for aviation. The rest of Australia, you can fly domestically. But Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, pretty much locked down at this point. Not easy. The restrictions on crews, it's got to be a specific flight that the government approves. There's all sorts of barriers. Going forward, I worry a little bit, well, not a little, I do worry a lot, that it'll be a uncoordinated patchwork of rules and regulations as we go forward. And that'll be a big turn-off for sure. But that's going to apply to airlines.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute, because you've got organizations like AsBAA, you've got the NBAA in the States and everything. Is there one voice speaking for business aviation that is helping to coordinate that's talking with people like ICAO or WHO or any of the international organizations doing that on behalf of business aviation?
Well, in Asia, we've got AsBAA, as you mentioned, of which I've been involved with since it started 20 years ago now. And yes, we're working through IBAC, which is part of ICAO. So we're hoping that, like the IATA is stressing and how ICAO is stressing, that there is a coordinated response. Because we just after 9/11, I was thinking about this. We got used to the new norm after 9/11 and how the security element became a major intrusion on travel. And then there was a lot of gloom and doom about the reaction, and it took a bit of time for traffic to come back. So it'll be an adjustment. This one, though, is truly worldwide, is everywhere. And the other aspect we don't know is whether the virus situation will be in certain areas it'll be clear, or in certain areas it'll still be prevalent. So that will prevent a coordinated, systematic rollout of standard rules, I fear. But looking on the bright side, I'm hoping it'll settle down like everything did after 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, it is very interesting, and people talking about health passports now, like the old yellow cards that you used to have to carry showing that you were vaccinated for yellow fever and things like that. And Emirates is testing people at the airports now, so it's really interesting. Quick question about the OEMs, Bombardier, Gulfstream, Dassault. A lot of people are saying that they basically have, based on the lessons they learned from 2008, 2009, that they have sort of right-sized production. Would you agree with that?
Well, in 2008, there was the speculator, and prices were artificially elevated, and the market was quite out of control at that point. The OEMs moved against the speculation. That isn't the case today. The East European speculators are gone, and they were pretty severely hurt. So that's a scenario. So there wasn't this artificial market that was created by the speculator. So there's that. But I would say that by and large, we built back up to the numbers of airplanes, the market that were being produced in 2008. It's shifted very much towards the larger aircraft. If you look at the sort of scale and size of aircraft, everything from sort of a G500, 600, the Globals, 6, I get the numbers wrong here, 6,500, 5,500, 7,500. It's tongue twister, this one. And of course, the Dassault numbers, the 6, 7, and 9, 6, 8, and 9. So there's a lot of top-end capacity coming out, which will put out, from our perspective, pre-owned airplanes, which is the opportunities we seek. So I can see it growing. I think, by and large, it's balanced. We don't, as I say, we don't have this bubble of price and supply that was in 2008.
Well, we're going to talk some deals here in a minute. Let's talk image for just a little bit. Business aviation always has this image problem, and it doesn't help when some Hollywood star or rapper is showing off the jet that they're flying on and things like that. And everybody tries, the key selling point is the CEO and his takeover team can be in 5 cities at once, not at once, but, in a day, and be home for dinner with the family that night. And again, we talked a little bit earlier about that the virus might be a new selling point for it, for business aviation. But that comes also, remember the car makers who flew to D.C. for congressional hearings. They got a lot of flack for flying privately. CEOs of companies that have had to lay off people, they're probably, the optics of them getting on the G4 or the G5 is probably not going to be good at this time. You think that's right?
Well, obviously, just some companies will be impacted financially out of all of this. No question, certain business sectors will suffer more than most. I speculate which ones, and we might find that the way of doing business changes. So where one door closes, another one opens. So I wouldn't say it's all someone who's flying today isn't going to fly tomorrow. It's too early to say. There's no Harvard business course for this one. But the image side of it, well, we've lived with that ever since Sinatra had his Learjet. So I don't see that as a huge, big impediment. I do think that if the airlines start to pull back certain route combinations, city pairs, they will be playing into the hands of our industry, our side of the business, where communications and time. And when you're a multi-billion-dollar company, time is money. There's no question. That doesn't change. It doesn't change at all.
Let me ask you another question. That's now we'll get into sort of the transaction side happening. You said that you are still working on deals. Obviously, you're not going to tell me who's buying or who's selling. This is kind of a multi-part question. Number one, are you seeing distressed sales? Are we seeing sales from bankruptcies? My understanding is that banks are not rushing to repossess aircraft like they did during the financial crisis because they want to be in the banking industry, not in the aircraft industry. We're seeing, there was one broker who was saying that they were seeing a sort of an uptick in the virtual shopper looking at the company's website based on the numbers, looking at their listings. Is that what you're seeing? Let's talk about distressed sales first.
I would say if you look at the numbers of aircraft for sale in the last few months, it's only gone up about 0.5%. So the growth isn't suddenly there's 100 companies throwing out their airplanes onto the market. That hasn't happened. The banks are certainly managing difficult transactions, but I think they've got wiser over the years, not just this year. I think previously there was a rush, go and repossess and then resell. That I think we're able to help some of our bankers who fund Jetcraft, and when we go out and acquire aircraft, we're able to help steer that process, understand the better way to manage an aircraft that may have some financial problems, rather than just dump it on the market, because that's in no one's interest to drop the price, the value. There'll be all sorts of loans have to be called in if you trigger that sort of event. So managing the issue, I think, has been crucial over the years. And this has been good in the run-up to what's happened now. And the numbers of aircraft that are suddenly available is only very small. And I wouldn't even call it suddenly available. There's a natural move. There's a lot of new airplanes coming out, a lot of new types coming online. So there's going to be an increase of airplanes, and they've got to be sold. And unfortunately, I can't get out of the confines of Hong Kong to go and do what I do, which is try and sell airplanes.
Well, I was reading some of your past history and some of the stories that have been written about you, and you said that was just one of your favorite things was to get out and meet face to face and meet people, and that brings me exactly to the next question. I mean, and we've touched on this a little bit already. As good as Microsoft Teams and WhatsApp and Skype and WeChat, and you can stay connected to customers, you can stay connected to employees, but you can't really seal the deal that way. I mean, it's kind of like that new car smell. You want to, walk down the aisle of the jet. You want to feel the seat, the leather on the seats, and the countertops and the tables. I mean, if you're paying 50, 60, 70, 80 million dollars for something.
That hasn't changed. It is a factor that I think is very crucial in our business, more so in the business jet market. People want to feel, as you say, feel, touch, and just experience it. But it's also bearing in mind it's arguably one of the ultimate assets that you can buy. And if you're a successful businessman and you've generated enough funds to buy one of these, then you will want to enjoy it. So I don't think that's going to go away. I don't quite have the personal ability to go and do that, but if I went to go and buy a car, I tend to want to go and see it. So I would say that's not going to change. And that is a crucial part of our job, to my mind. So this being hemmed in for the last 3 months has been a stress.
I understand, but it's affected my family too. My wife's outside working at the dining table. My son's in his bedroom doing homework online there. Back to deal making. I know you can't disclose individual deals, and I wouldn't ask you to do that. Walk us through the process right now. You said you had some in the works. What is sort of the process that you're going through right now, and how do you deal with the lawyers?
Well, I don't think lawyers have changed. They're still the same, except they're probably working from more exotic locations than many people. But the transaction's fundamentally the same. What you've got to do, look at the airplane, check it out technically, legally, fund it, then do the closing, etc. So the process hasn't changed, but the mechanics of that process have become complicated. Where do you do the inspection? Because there's labor restrictions, there are constraints of access to airspace, there's crew getting them there, all these things. So it's been a patchwork of fiddling around trying to find, well, I've got that problem solved and another one springs up over here. Or you solve that problem and then that creates something else. But there was one thing that came up recently with a transaction we did with a Falcon airplane. And it took me back to the 1970s and 80s. So there is some benefit of having grey hair, which is accepting an aircraft in international airspace. Now, in the old days, we used to go off, fly out 12 miles, circle around, all have a bit of a laugh, come back, and in that time, you sign the paperwork. Well, that was one solution. And it was almost as if lawyers had forgotten, well, that actually works. So that was an interesting little dynamic twist that came out of one transaction. But getting down to sort of the serious things, I've got a customer in Mexico looking at an airplane that's in Malaysia and marrying that together and getting everything sorted out just takes a lot longer. The paperwork will look the same when it's all signed, and 6 months from now when we look at it, it won't be any different other than moving it around, finding out an inspection facility that's got the labor that we can get into and that the crew don't get stuck. There's a lot of interesting things we've got to sort out.
Well, when you mentioned the dates there in the 70s and the 80s and all of that, it reminded me that, and you being based in Hong Kong and me having formerly lived in Hong Kong for 10 years, I saw with great sadness that Jimmy's Kitchen was closing.
Yes. So I was one of those places you say, oh, I'm sad it's going. Then you think, when was the last time I went there? 20 years ago? No, I'm exaggerating, 10 years ago. Well, yeah, it is going.
I went there a few times. I loved it because the menu had all these old recipes that I grew up with in the 1960s, and it was a lot of fun. Anyway, a little side note there.
Well, we're going to lose a few bars, I think, and watering holes as a result of all this.
Yeah. From my short time, I've been editor of the magazine for 5 years now, and business aviation, I keep hearing about the great potential it has in Asia. It's got super potential. At every conference I go to, everybody talks about the potential, but it seems like we're just not getting there yet. It's hard to get slots, or at least convenient slots, if you don't want to fly from Hong Kong to Thailand and land at 4 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning or something like that. And I mean, are things loosening up? Is the outlook better? Or if I fly from Singapore to Hong Kong, do I have to park my jet in Shenzhen?
No. is the answer. You'll get into Hong Kong. If you've got there's a slot to get you out, to get you to Shenzhen. So, I mean, that's a bit defeatist if you end up moving your airplane again. But I think there are some obvious infrastructure issues that exist in the region, which are developing slower than we might like, I might like, anyone might like. Airport access can be complicated because the airlines have been growing so rapidly and stealing the space, if that's the right way of putting it. But if you look at some of the plans for the Greater Bay Area, hopefully when things relax a bit more, the opening up the bridges there. I was just think ahead of something I was working on. Macau is only another 5 miles further away than Farnborough is from central London. So there's no reason why with the infrastructure, with the bridge and with a special immigration pass, which is being talked about, one we're going to drive from central Hong Kong to Macau and fly out of there if Hong Kong's not available. Like one does, takes the traffic down the M3 in London to go down to Farnborough. Not people do that regularly. So I can see that we've got the ability to grow this business in the region, in this area. I think if you do look at China specifically, it's still only got about 400 or 500 airports, whereas the United States is over 5,000. So just the dynamic of that in itself restricts business aviation. And people use smaller aircraft in North America, whereas they don't out here. This is dominantly a ultra long range market. The distances are a long way. No question. I'm a long way from anywhere.
You said in an interview a while back that you got started in the industry, a gentleman named Desmond Norman, who designed and built a bush plane. I can't remember what it was, a 10-seater.
Yeah, the 10-seat Islander, right. Yeah, the Britten-Norman Islander.
Right. Would you I mean, given the ups and downs of aviation, and it was funny, I was listening to a webinar the other day, and I forget the gentleman who said it, but he said if you go back to the time of the Wright brothers actually, when they flew the first plane to today, he said aviation has never made a profit. He said it's lost money over, from beginning to the current time on a net base. Some years have been good, some have been down, but net, it's been a loss, and he didn't know why anybody would want to go into aviation. Would you recommend this to your kids to go into aviation, in whether it's a broker or whether it's commercial or in any form?
Yes, I'm been in aviation since I left school. I didn't see any other direction I wanted to be. I think it's a passionate business. It's interesting. Everything, every day. I mean, my job now, no two deals are the same. As I was saying, Mexico and Malaysia. Next week it might be Kazakhstan and Australia. And so the variables are there. There's no cookie element to this job. It's quite a varied job, and that's the bit I like. And the reason I like Asia particularly is everything is new. You go to North America, it's a bit more regularized. But no, I would say whether people have not made money, I don't know. I haven't looked at it in that sense, but I think as an industry, I think it's dynamic. People sometimes forget that it moves a lot slower than they think. Because the 747, for example, has been around since the mid-'60s in a design concept terms, and people quite happily get on it today. But what's going on under the bonnet, as it were, the technology of the avionics and stuff, there's a lot of segments where there's a lot of very interesting stuff going on. And going forward, different fuels, electrical applications, I think there's still a lot to go and there's still a lot to learn.
Really quickly, and getting back to sort of business aviation specifically, what do you think will make a comeback faster? Small, medium-sized jets, or is it going to be the big iron?
I think they'll all come back pretty much the same.
Pretty much the same?
Pretty much the same. I think the type of client base will, perhaps the charter will come back quicker, because in charter and maybe fractionals, because obviously in North America, you fly for 6 hours, you're still in the United States. You fly for 6 minutes here, you're in Macau, and then you're into Taiwanese airspace, and then you're back into Chinese airspace. So the whole dynamic of that is a little different. But I think Europe and the States can, from a fractional charter, just can get going quicker. But a lot depends on whether this sort of maze of regulations becomes a constraint and something we have to worry about. But the need to fly long range, I think less stops will become a factor. People will try and avoid transiting places because of the perception of exposure, but also the fact that you will find complications with crew and regulations and all those factors. So there's a lot of good things, I think, across the business, which if we get this right, if it goes right, it'll come back strongly.
Well, that brings me to my last question. I mean, obviously, we don't want to downplay the seriousness of the crisis. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. Millions of people are out of work. I mean, it's somebody said this is the biggest crisis that aviation has faced, but it's also, a crisis for the rest of the world. So we don't want to downplay the seriousness of it. But is there a bright spot that you can point to? I think you touched on it a little bit, but what can people in business aviation look forward to?
Well, obviously, what's happened over the last 6 months, I often describe as 9/11. It's the financial crisis that we had in Asia in '97. It's the SARS crisis. It's the 2008 all rolled into one, and still more. So there is no, as I joked before, course for this one. There's no, what did they do in the past? Because there's no sort of playbook here on this one. So to sort of speculate where we go and what form we're going to emerge from this is a bit tough. You hear lots of theories being talked about. There is no normal that we used to know. There's going to be a new normal, whatever that new normal turns out to be. But I think from this business point of view, I do think the realization of the value of the flexibility of business aviation and the value in time, because I do think that is going to become a major turn-off. I mean, I used to pop down to Bangkok for a night and come back and things like that for a business meeting, or go down to Singapore. That'll become very much more difficult. Now, for someone who has the ability to own an airplane, they might just choose to do that.
Okay. David Dixon, President, Jetcraft Asia, thanks for joining me in conversation.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.